Okay. Absence of die casting. So die casting, and maybe we'll segue right into die casting right now.
All right.
Johnson, on the other hand, their mission was to make the lightest possible outboard. They really got good at it. And they hired a fellow by the name of Rainiac, probably in the mid-20s, or maybe even before then, that was just had a head for die casting.
Should we walk over to the Johnson?
Yeah, let's walk over to the Johnson. And here we don't have an early Johnson twin, but that's okay. We'll use this J25, which is very similar in a sense from a manufacturing point of view. It's a single cylinder. It's not the twin like the so-called water bug. But this Rainiac fellow was such a good die casting guy. He just had a head for production. And
what is die casting? Is it metal molds?
Yes. So so that was one of the breakthroughs. Sand casting, as we saw in that video, is a really messy process. It's dirty,
and that's the way that Evinrude was made too.
Yeah, with that process.
That rowboat motor, right?
That's really messy.
Rudder twin.
And for years people said, how do we make these wonderful parts without this sand?
Okay.
And so one of the things that early on became die casting, and that's an all steel mold, usually like hardened tool steel, and the metal, aluminum metal, is injected under pressure, almost like today plastic injection molding, and that resulted in some really nice fine parts that needed almost no machining. Like this particular piece is die cast. A lot of the pieces on this motor, the carburetor really shows really good die casting excellence, and
really, those were basically injection molded into a steel mold.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, with hot aluminum. Now there were other die casting efforts in the 20s that we've seen today that were less successful, and that was with a material called pot metal. And you see a lot of pieces from the 20s, some carburetors,
like that Evinrude over there,
some ignition parts, where the pot metal actually disintegrated and due to some metallurgical internal reaction.
Well, my understanding was when pot metal was actually, that's just what it was. They'd throw anything they felt like into it, and some mixtures were terrible.
It was mostly zinc with other materials thrown in.
Right.
And
the guys who did that had their secret ingredients.
Right.
Okay. But that's injected molded right there. That's different. That's not pot metal?
It's this exact same process.
Okay.
But done with aluminum.
Okay.
Now, one would ask, well, why if we have beautiful, successful die-cast aluminum parts, why would anybody use pot metal? Why would they do that? It melts at a much lower temperature. So
okay.
That's the advantage.
Okay, so
these were
expensive carburetors to make then.
So the temperature that this probably got injected with was maybe as much as 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit.
Okay.
And I think pot metal would be down maybe 800 or something like that.
All right.
Roughly.
All right.
Roughly. So Johnson became real pioneers. And let's look at the crankcase too on this one. You can't really see too much, but that crankcase is even die cast.
Oh, it is.
Yeah.
Okay.
You see how fine the features are?
Yeah,
it's not
it is.
rough.
Yeah, it's not rough at all.
Yet some things are still sand cast, and I believe this transom bracket on this one may be sand cast still.
It looks sand cast.
And that has to do with the intricacies, coring, undercuts, things, die casting, because the metal is hard tooling. You can't have any catches, like any undercuts. So the mold separates. It's got to separate clean.
That's true of any of them.
Yeah,
correct?
really.
Of sand casting.
Sand casting, you have a little more flexibility because the sand just breaks away.
Okay.
So it's not so fussy, but it's still.
So what about the lower unit on this?
That one might be die cast.
You think that might be die cast?
It looks it. Yeah, sure. I'd say so.
Okay. It does to me too.
Yeah.
But this one over here would not have been on the P30.
No. So, in a sense, going back to sand casting, again, it's the quick entry into outboard world.
Okay.
If they took the time to make hardened steel die-cast tooling for all this. It would be add, let's say, a great amount of time to what we would say today, time to market.
Okay.
So what would happen, and even Jim Webb would talk about that in his writings, the time to market on sand cast parts were weeks at most. In other words,
Yep.
you can have an idea what it should be, give it to a good pattern maker. The patterns are carved wood. The right pattern maker would make the right tooling to fit the frames or flasks, as they're called, and in a matter of days, if not weeks, you'd have cast parts. They go to the machine shop. The good fixture guy would have fixtures to hold the parts. So
in a time period when we had these things, like this engine was the hottest thing in 1925, because usually models were. This is a 1926 model. It was introduced in August of 25.
Yes. Yeah.
This motor was the fastest, hottest thing on, and by 1926, it was obsolete. So we had to come out with something new and better.
Right. So the next year, there's literally, other than the flywheel and maybe the steering rail, there's nothing interchangeable between this and the next year's model.
Right.
The P35s, it's called. So it probably pained Rainiac to go back to sand, but they had the wisdom then that, well, the products that we know we're going to make a lot of and aren't going to change too much, we're staying with die casting.
So would an example of this be over here in these late 30s engines?
Yeah.
The lower units seem to be very constant.
This one's a little different, but.
That lower unit there
That's
looks
all
kind of, it looks die-cast.
Oh, sure,
It looks die-cast too. It's very thin.
Yep.
Very thin, very, it looks fragile.
Yeah, and I think this piece. No, that's sand.
Maybe it might be sand cast. Yeah.
Anyway,
Okay.
so
the more you made, like this model right here, probably just about everything was die-cast.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Because they sold
For years and
hundreds
years
of
and
thousands
years.
of those.
So the tooling, was expensive, but they got their money's worth.
Okay.
They made so
But
many
they had to
parts.
make, they had to work,
Right.
and they had to make lots of them.
Right. Yep.
And if you didn't, you lost your shirt.
Right.
Okay.
So one more thing while we're kind of in the early days, and that would be just to talk about permanent mold casting. So there's kind of a halfway point between sand casting and die casting. And this Evernude N Sport Twin piece, this transom bracket was made with what's called permanent mold casting. And it's really interesting because this copy...
So permanent mold would be actual metal
molds.
Metal molds
Instead
that
of
you
sand.
pour into instead of sand,
right.
so you could use it repeatedly.
Yes, the same
Okay.
mold over and over
But
again.
how would you make it so when you had to pull it away,
Yeah,
you couldn't...
So there were lots of little sliding little pieces that would come
okay.
out, and
Okay.
you can see result evidence of all those sliding pieces. Like there was a piece in
little
here,
seams where the
and there's,
pieces came
there's-
together.
right.
Okay.
Another piece here,
All right.
another piece, probably
Okay.
along here. I don't know, but
Okay.
when you look at these castings, you can see different little evidence of things like
But
that.
that would have been a complex mold to make.
Yeah, but really, not so hard.
Not so hard.
Because what would happen is that the mold would come from the same pattern makers that were doing the sand casting stuff.
Okay.
So pattern maker would make a pattern that he'd want the mold to look like.
Okay.
So they would cast a mold out of cast iron
Okay.
in the pieces that they needed to do that. So
Okay.
back to the sand, we're going to make our cast iron molds
Okay.
that fit together, and now we're going to go to the foundry with molten aluminum, and we're going to fill these cast iron molds.
Okay.
And of course, temperature.
So aluminum had a lot to do with this too. When you
Oh,
went
sure.
from cast iron to aluminum,
Yeah,
that was when
allows
these
this process.
allows that process.
Right.
And also injection molding, I would think too, to some degree,
Yeah.
would facilitate aluminum would facilitate injection molding
Right.
as well.
So the big difference between permanent mold and injection molding is injection molding that molten metal was injected under high pressure
Okay.
and into the cavity, and as permanent mold, it was done just like pouring into a.
So most of these engines, like the stuff that was made in the 50s,
Yeah.
now that must all be injection molding.
No.
No,
No.
okay.
So that's the next whole back to time to market. And some of the older original outboards, that had been making outboards for many years, like Johnson and Evinrude, they really introduced their products as die-cast products, like this
Okay.
here, that one, and that. Those are probably all die-cast.
Okay.
All die-cast components. I guess they really trusted their design. They had good designs, and they just said, okay, we're not gonna fool around with sand. We're gonna go right to hardened steel, injection molded tooling at great expense, but they planned on making so many outboards for so many years that that's how all that worked.
Okay.
Certainly, it's a lot of planning. I mean, if you having a platform that you can grow with injection molded piece is a little more restrictive. Okay, can you bore it bigger? Can you make more horsepower? I think that in the early 50s when they made that 25 so well, they decided we want to make a 30 now. They were kind of held back with their tooling to how much they could poke it. I don't know if they went to slightly more bore or just higher compression or what to get that 5 more horsepower. I'm not an expert on those motors, but so that showed some way that they were retarded in such a way that they couldn't.
Because they
jump
were
to
stuck
a
with a
bigger-
permanent mold.
Yeah.
Yes, right.
Okay. But
To make
this-
the cost.
But other makers approached it a little bit different. And there are two makers in particular. One of them, and I believe it was in 49, Elgin 16 horse. If anybody have seen any of those, if you look at them carefully, that whole thing is sandcast. I mean, even the littlest recoil start bracket from the like the block over to the recoil housing or
They
something.
must have been quite heavy.
I think so. I think it was.
Yeah.
But again, it's somebody in the company said we need to have this much horsepower
Today.
in 2 months.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
And that's how they did it.
Right.
Okay. This is another really good example, and it's not talked about. There's a lot. I hear a lot of talk about these Chris Craft, these bigger ones, the commanders, about they were going to get sued by Mercury. There was this, and there was a lot of talk about why they just vanished from the market. And I really think that one of the reasons why they vanished was possibly the fear of a suit. But more importantly, this whole thing is sandcast.
Okay.
And I've seen these blocks, and they're quite a rough casting.
Yeah, they are.
And again,
They are.
time to market from
Right.
when these guys thought that we want to make this size outboard motor, they probably had it on a boat in 2 months,
I can believe it.
compared to maybe 6 months if they had to do tooling. So at some point, it's my guess that maybe with the fear of Mercury, the huge cost of converting this over to an all die-cast motor, they may have just said, look, we're just going to just stop. We're not going to
Okay.
bother. And there's also a story about these champions as well. And the demise of the champions, and this is actually a story
Just
in an
the opposite.
outboarder. Some years ago there was a really good article about the champion story in the outboard. And I don't know what year and what month, unfortunately, at this time, but there is a great story. And they talk about this whole business, the 16 horse and the tandem 33 and all that. Well, these guys were up against the horsepower race, okay? So they said, well, and this is a die-cast motor. This is a wonderful piece of engineering from a die-casting point of view. You can really see how
Very expensive. They had a lot of money tied up in this.
a lot of
thing.
money tied up in this, and it was really a very light, for its horsepower, it's a very light engine. It's really quite